The year is 2025. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. Cities are still lit. Restaurants are still full. Luxury cars still idle at red lights. Engines humming softly, waiting. If you scroll your phone, you'll see the same story you've always seen. People traveling, people celebrating, people posting lives that look insulated from consequences. It feels like prosperity survived everything. But that feeling is misleading, because what you're looking at is not wealth, it's momentum. It's the echo of a financial system that no longer exists, still vibrating through lifestyles that haven't caught up yet. Behind closed doors, something has changed. There is a quiet panic spreading through rooms that were once calm. Not the panic of poverty, something worse. The panic of people who thought they were untouchable. Because for the first time in decades, a growing number of wealthy individuals are discovering a truth that rewrites everything they believed about money. They are rich on paper and dangerously poor in reality. This isn't about losing status, not yet. This is about losing control. For most of modern history, wealth meant one thing: cash flow. You earned money. You saved money. You owned things outright. But somewhere along the way, the definition changed. Quietly. Wealth stopped meaning money you have. It started meaning assets you own, stock you never sold, companies you never exited, buildings you never intended to liquidate. Cash became inefficient. Selling became irrational. Debt became intelligent. Why sell an asset and trigger taxes when a bank would happily lend against it? Why realize gains when you could borrow cheaply and let appreciation do the work? This logic wasn't fringe. It was mainstream. Financial advisors promoted it. Banks engineered products around it. The wealthy internalized it as sophistication. And for more than a decade, the system rewarded them. Interest rates stayed low. Asset prices climbed. Leverage felt safe. Being rich no longer meant being liquid. It meant being connected. Connected to credit. Connected to valuations. Connected to the assumption that tomorrow would always look like yesterday. But that assumption has quietly collapsed. Because leverage is not wealth. Leverage is a promise that the future will cooperate. And in 2025, the future is no longer cooperating. The first cracks didn't come from a crash you could point to. They came from something far more dangerous: tightening. Rates rose. Credit became selective. Banks stopped assuming upside. And suddenly, people who had everything realized they had almost nothing they could actually use. No cash cushion, no margin for error, no ability to absorb shock, just obligations. This is the moment where illusion meets reality, where net worth stops being a number and starts being a liability. And this is why the collapse you're about to witness will not look dramatic. At first, there will be no sirens, no headlines screaming panic, just delayed payments, frozen credit lines, awkward phone calls, then silence. Because the most dangerous kind of financial collapse doesn't happen loudly. It happens politely. And by the time the world notices, the damage is already done. To understand why so many wealthy people are collapsing at the same time, you have to understand one word: leverage. Leverage is the engine behind modern wealth. It's also the blade now cutting it apart. For years, leverage was treated like intelligence. If you were rich and you weren't borrowing, you were considered unsophisticated. Why hold cash earning nothing when assets were rising faster than inflation? Why sell stock when banks were offering loans at rates that felt almost imaginary? So, the wealthy stopped spending their money. They borrowed against it. Stocks became collateral. Businesses became collateral. Real estate became collateral. Everything was pledged to the future. As long as asset prices went up and interest stayed low, the system felt frictionless, elegant, safe. But leverage has a rule that most people ignore. It works perfectly until it doesn't. Because leverage is not neutral, it amplifies everything. When prices rise, it multiplies gains. When prices fall, it multiplies losses. And when credit tightens, it turns instantly from friend to executioner. Here's the part most people don't see. Banks don't lend against what you believe your assets are worth. They lend against what they believe they can recover. When markets were booming, banks were generous. They assumed liquidity. They assumed buyers. They assumed exits. Now they don't. And when that assumption changes, the rules change overnight. Credit lines get reviewed. Collateral gets revalued. Loan-to-value ratios get recalculated. This is where the illusion shatters. Someone worth tens of millions on paper can suddenly be asked for cash they don't have. Not next year, not after a sale. Now, this is called a margin call, and it doesn't care about your lifestyle, your reputation, or your intentions. If you can't pay, the bank doesn't argue. It liquidates. This is why so many wealthy people right now aren't losing money. They're losing time to sell assets properly, time to restructure debt, time to think. They're being forced to act under pressure, the worst possible condition for preserving wealth. And here's the cruel irony. Most of these people didn't do anything reckless by the standards of the last decade. They followed best practices. They listened to professionals. They optimized. But optimization assumes stability. And stability is gone. What we're witnessing now is not a moral failure. It's a structural one. A system built on cheap money is being forced to operate without it. And systems don't adapt gracefully. They snap. This is why wealth is vanishing quietly. Not through headlines, but through spreadsheets, not through scandal, but through recalculations. The rich aren't being punished for excess. They're being punished for exposure. Because when leverage unwinds, it doesn't ask who deserves it. It only asks who is liquid enough to survive. And most aren't. Every financial collapse has a moment when recovery is still possible. And then there is the moment after, the moment when the math no longer works, no matter how optimistic the story becomes. For the wealthy in 2025, that moment is being reached through three forces acting together. The first is illiquidity. The second is obligation. The third is time. Commercial real estate is where these forces collide. For decades, owning office buildings was considered the safest form of serious wealth. They weren't meant to be exciting. They were meant to be permanent. Stable tenants, predictable cash flow, easy refinancing. But permanence was an illusion built on one assumption: that demand would always exist. That assumption is gone. Buildings are emptier than expected. Leases are shorter. Tenants negotiate harder. And, most critically, loans are maturing. Commercial loans don't last forever. They come due. When that happens, owners must refinance at today's rates and today's valuations, not yesterday's fantasies. And this is where the trap closes. If the value of the building has fallen below the loan attached to it, the owner doesn't have a problem. They have a verdict. The bank won't refinance the full amount. It demands the difference in cash, not equity, not promises, cash. For many owners, that money doesn't exist, so they hand over the keys. Not because they want to, because there is no alternative. This is how wealth disappears without drama. No bankruptcy filings, no public collapse, just ownership quietly transferred from individuals to institutions. At the same time, lifestyle costs continue to rise. Private education doesn't pause for downturns. Staff doesn't accept excuses. Insurance disappears in high-risk areas. The wealthy don't feel inflation at the grocery store. They feel it in survival expenses for their way of life. And once that burn rate is set, it cannot be reduced gently. You either maintain the lifestyle or it collapses. This is when desperation begins, because when people lose money, they adjust. But when people lose identity, they resist. They take risks they wouldn't have taken before. They chase deals they don't fully understand. They delay reality with optimism. This is where denial becomes dangerous, because the final stage of collapse is psychological, the refusal to accept that the world has changed. This is why so many financial downfalls end not with downsizing, but with fraud, litigation, or ruin. Not because people are evil, but because they are terrified of falling from a height they spent their entire lives climbing. And here is the final truth. The wealthy are not collapsing because they were greedy. They are collapsing because they confused leverage with strength, because they believed access to credit was the same as security, because they built lives that required tomorrow's money to survive today. True wealth is not valuation. It is not optics. It is not leverage. True wealth is resilience. It is the ability to absorb shock without begging institutions for mercy. The tragedy of 2025 is not that the rich are going broke. It's that they're discovering too late that they were never as rich as they thought. And by the time that realization arrives, there is no rewind.